if all government workers disappeared? The meteorologists tracking hurricanes, the cybersecurity experts protecting our infrastructure, the food inspectors, the public health workers. What happens when they're gone? Although this is becoming ever closer to being reality, this episode isn't about politics. It's about something bigger. Who do we take for granted? And why do we only notice some workers when things go wrong? Welcome to Spiritual Geography. I'm Joni Miller. Think back to the early days of the pandemic. Suddenly, the people we often barely notice, the grocery clerks, the truck drivers, the meat packers, became essential. We always needed them, but now, maybe for the first time, we truly saw what they added to our lives, since part of the work that goes on beyond our conscious awareness was suddenly missing. I remember hearing stories of vegetables rotting in the fields and COVID outbreaks at meat packing plants. At one point, I stared at a head of romaine lettuce and pondered the numerous people who worked to pick, pack, ship, and stock this simple head of lettuce while I was safely at home. A wave of gratitude washed over me. During the pandemic, we recognized these workers because we could see what was missing. But there's another group of essential workers we don't always see, even when they're right in front of us. Government workers. We don't think about them until crisis strikes, whether it's a food safety recall, a natural disaster, or a pandemic. That head of romaine lettuce was also impacted by government workers. Behind every safe meal, there's a network of scientists, inspectors, and public health workers ensuring that what we eat won't harm us. Most people never think about them until there's a bacterial outbreak in our food supply. Then USDA inspectors and FDA scientists who monitor outbreaks of salmonella or listeria, and public health teams of epidemiologists and health investigators often work long hours to find the source of infection before more people get sick. There are lots of other government workers we often overlook. Firefighters battling massive blazes in the wilderness. Scientists tracking seismic activity and providing warnings. Air and water quality inspectors. The list goes on and on. These are people whose work touches our lives daily, work so reliable we barely notice it. And yet, when we think of government workers, we don't picture these roles. Instead, we picture a bureaucrat. I know a different side of government work. I grew up around D.C., and my dad was a federal employee. And later, I spent nearly 20 years as a government contractor. I've known public servants my whole life, and here's what I saw. Dedicated people who care deeply about their work. Many of them could earn more in the private sector, but they stayed in government because they believed in what they were doing. I tended to see their work the way they did, helping people have safer and more fulfilling lives. I know that sounds idealistic, but it is my impression of the people I've met in many different parts of the federal government, from DOD to the Library of Congress, people who wanted to make the country and the world better. We can disagree on how to make the world better, but I rarely doubted the motivation of the people I met. Not everyone sees it that way. Government workers are often disparaged. Things like government workers are lazy, they just sit around collecting paychecks, or they'd never survive in the private sector. When we hear the word bureaucrat, most of us picture someone in a gray office buried in paperwork. It's easy to imagine government workers as distant or disconnected, creating needless rules for others to follow. And for some, government work is just pushing paper. But for others, like my dad, every policy, every decision was about real people. My dad was an urban planner who worked in the Department of Housing and Urban Development. He saw his work as helping to create safer communities where people could thrive. My dad went to work during the snowstorm in 1979 that dumped nearly 20 inches of snow on the D.C. area, and he traveled on foot and via an assortment of buses to get to work because there were officials from state governments visiting that week. He was neither lazy nor just sitting around or whatever other stereotype someone might ascribe to federal workers. For him, every rule had a purpose. He knew his decisions weren't just policies on paper. They affected real people's lives, and he cared deeply about getting that right. Yes, government paperwork can be frustrating. And yes, sometimes bureaucracy is slow. And yes, just like with any large organization, there are people who don't pull their weight. But government is also the mechanism that tries to keep things fair, to make sure decisions aren't just made on a whim, and to protect people who otherwise wouldn't have a voice. Every time we drive on a safe road, eat food that won't make us sick, or know our bank accounts are insured, there's a bureaucrat behind the scenes making sure the system works. Their job isn't glamorous, but that doesn't mean it isn't essential. Maybe it's time we see government workers not as faceless, ineffectual bureaucrats, but as people. People whose work makes our lives safer, healthier, and more stable, even when we don't realize it. We don't have to agree on everything, but what if we agree on this? Paying attention. What if we noticed government workers not just in times of crisis, but in the everyday ways they keep our lives running? What if we recognized their work before it was missing from our lives? Perhaps that starts with something simple, like noticing their work or even offering a quiet thank you. The scientist monitoring food safety, the inspector ensuring clean drinking water, the public servant who shows up day after day believing their work matters, even if no one sees it. When we start paying attention to people as individuals, as people with purpose, doing the best they can every day, it becomes harder to fall into simple stereotypes. And maybe that's where the true ethic of loving thy neighbor begins. We don't understand the mysteries of the universe, but we can grow more love. Love for ourselves, love for others, and love for the infinite mystery that lays beyond our understanding. Thank you for tuning in.